And welcome to our special workshop, our special council meeting for the last day of April. I'd like to let you all know that this meeting is being audio and video recorded and live streamed on the Town of Innisfil's YouTube channel and shall form part of the record for which will be retained in accordance with the town's retention bylaw. And for more information about this collection, please contact the clerk's office. So thank you everyone who's joining us on the live stream this evening, and staff, members of council, and our very hardworking ward boundary council composition or review session board. We really appreciate you all volunteering your time for your community. So thank you so much for being here tonight with us. I'd like to ask Councillor Zandela, please, to deliver the land acknowledgement statement.
The Town of Innisfil acknowledges that the Town of Innisfil is situated on treaty land that is steeped in rich Indigenous history. The town also acknowledges that this land is the traditional territories of the First Peoples of Turtle Island, and it is shared between the Anishinaabe people of Bosalea First Nation, the Chippewas of Rama First Nation, and the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation, and we thank them for their generations of stewardship. This meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people, and as settlers, we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. The town acknowledges the forced sacrifices that are the foundation of Canadian society today. We are dedicated to honoring Indigenous history and culture and committed to moving forward in a spirit of reconciliation and respect with all First Nation, Métis, and Inuit.
Thank you so much, Councillor Zanella. So we'll now move on to the approval of the agenda. We just have one item on tonight's special agenda. And mover and a seconder, please, to approve the recommendation. Moved by Councillor Richardson, seconded by Councillor Waters. All those in favor? That is carried. Are there any disclosures of interest on tonight's agenda? Any pecuniary interest? Seeing none, we'll go forward then with item 4, which is our business item for this evening. So I'd like to welcome Jack Amadelia. I hope I said that wrong. I'm sorry if I didn't. Welcome, and welcome again to the committee members, and whenever you're ready.
Do you have to do anything? Oh, this is on? Perfect. So thank you, and thanks to all of the council for having me here tonight. What we really want to do tonight is just provide council with a brief update as to where we are at so far in the ward boundary and council composition process, let you know a little bit of history, a little bit of context, what we're trying to do, what we've heard so far, and then a little bit about next steps. And we hope to keep this, mostly free form, so if there's any questions, any comments, any points of discussion that any members of council want to raise, please do so. As the mayor mentioned, we have the committee that we're working closely with here as well, so they're available for any comments or questions in addition to myself. Like was mentioned, my name's Jack Amendolia, very close on the last name. I'm a managing partner at a firm called Watson & Associates. We do a lot of work around Ontario with municipalities like yours, with school boards, municipal finance, growth forecasting, as well as ward boundary and council composition reviews. My right-hand man at the firm is Josh Valenti. He's a senior project coordinator. For those councillors who were at a public engagement session, you probably had a chance to meet him. He's not here tonight, but he does a lot of work behind the scenes and is really the brains behind the operation. And then we also work with a sub-consultant, Dr. Robert Williams. He's a municipal affairs specialist. He's a retired professor from the University of Waterloo, who's really spent his career studying municipal governance, municipal restructuring, council composition, and ward boundary reviews, and adds sort of that legislative background to our team. So that's a little bit about who the team is that's working on this review. So a couple of things that we want to get into tonight. Like I said, we want to talk a little bit about what we've been doing so far and kind of what the process looks like. I mentioned that it's very early in the process, so we haven't had a ton of feedback yet, but we have had information on the website. As I mentioned, we've had have had a first round of public engagement. We have a survey out there that people are starting to respond to. So we're starting to get some feel from your community about some things that from a council perspective, an accessibility perspective are important to them. We'll start to very briefly, again, we're at a very early stage, but we want to start to look at a couple of things, at least from our very preliminary analysis of things that we think work well, maybe things that we think could be a consideration or an issue. And then our next step is really taking everything that we've heard so far, taking the feedback that we've discussed tonight, and really then going off over the summer and starting to create some design of possible ward boundary adjustments to consider. So a little bit of context first, and I'm sure for most council members and most of the committee members, this is stuff that you're always already aware of, but I always think it's important to start any discussion just with a little bit of a refresher about sort of how we got to where we were. So the town of Innisfil formed from amalgamation, like many existing municipalities in Ontario through the late 80s and early 90s that went through amalgamation. In Innisfil, 1991 was when you went through amalgamation. Approximate population of about 21,500 people, and at that time was when the 7-ward system was created. Fast forward a little bit to 2009, and there were some adjustments made to that 7-ward system, but still 7 wards, mayor at large, deputy mayor at large. And that's the system that exists today. So council obviously knows you have 7 wards, 1 councillor per ward. So it's a symmetrical approach. You have a mayor that's elected at large, and you have a deputy mayor that's also elected at large. The mayor and deputy mayor also sit on your county council as your representatives there as well. The big difference, and we look at it on the screen, is the system is pretty much the same. But when the system was created in 91, you had a population, like I said, of about 21,500. Now in 2021, and that's according to the 21 census, it's more even in 2024, but in 2021, you're at 43,300, a little bit over that. So again, system is the same, but obviously, even just from a population perspective, Innisfil is a different place. Before we talk a little bit about composition, I just want to show you this, get into some of the different municipalities around Simcoe. So a couple of things to think about when we think about the composition of council. So there's not a lot of rules in terms of the legislation and what the legislation tells us we have to do. The legislation says you have to have a minimum council size of 5, and your mayor has to be elected at large. Full stop. That's pretty much what the legislation says. There's no guidelines as to how big your council can be. There's no guidelines as to what size based on certain population. And when we look at this chart, I mean, if I showed you a chart of Ontario, it's literally all over the place. There are no guidelines. There are no parameters. There's no sort of right size to tell you, based on your population, it should be this. But I think that's a good thing. I think that really speaks to the uniqueness of each municipality. It shouldn't just be, again, population, as we'll talk about tonight, it's important. It has to be important when we're doing a ward boundary review and trying to make sure that wards are accessible and councillors have an equitable amount of residents that they have to govern and they have to represent. But at the same time, there's a lot of uniqueness, right? We work in some places where they're really rural and, 3/4 of the council are farmers. And they might have a really large council when you look at it based on population. But the feedback they tell us is that based on the other things that they have to do for their work, and it's a part-time job, is that they need a council of that size because they don't have as much time as maybe other ones do. Other places are really large, and while it might not have the same population impacts, councillors say, for me to get from one ward, from one end of my ward to another, and even to have 3 visits in a day, it takes me hours. So that's I think what this chart shows, is that I think that's a good thing that there's no guideline or parameter, because what it says is it does recognize the uniqueness of each place. That said, we'll mention for a couple of minutes, I just want to point out a couple of things that we're looking at within Simcoe County. So again, variance is a big one. There's a couple of 5s, those are the minimums. The biggest one is New Tech at 10 councillors. When we look at sort of the 3 biggest municipalities, yourself, New Tech, Bradford, West Gwillimbury, all between 9 and 10 councillors, all have pretty similar persons per member when we look at sort of how those municipalities are represented. So definitely some consistency at the top, I think, in Simcoe County. But then when you look at a couple of the other councils that have 9 members, it varies significantly. You have one of the smallest municipalities in terms of Penetanguishene at around 10,000, also with a 9-member council. You have Clearview at around 15,000, also a 9-member council. Then you have Collingwood at around 25,000, also a 9-member council. So you start to get the drift that, you know, there's some uniformity when we look at Simcoe County in terms of the largest municipalities, but then, you know, you look at other similar council sizes and population is right across the board. And even for that matter, when we look at the 2 smallest councils in Essa and Tiny, those are the minimum size councils you can have at 5. Essa, population of around 23,000, Tiny, population of around 13,000. So even at that minimum number, we can't point to any kind of population standard to say this is the number that it should be. So I kind of just wanted council to have a clear understanding of that, and you know, once we get into council size and talk about different numbers, we'll probably refer back to, you know, some of this conversation and some of this chart. So I started to touch on the legislative framework, so I'm going to be brief because there's not a lot to talk about here when we talk about the legislation that guides this. I mentioned quickly when we talked about council size, the legislation says that you have to have, like I said, a minimum council size of 5. 1 has to be the mayor elected at large. It really stops there. After that, really what the legislation does is allows you as council to determine a lot of these things. So the size of the council is, again, minimum of 5, but how big you get beyond that is up to council. It's a council decision. How council is elected, so whether you're elected now, 7 wards, 1 council member per ward, deputy mayor elected at large, council has the authority to change that. You can have 3 councillors per ward. You can have some wards that have 1 councillor, some wards that have 2. You can have areas that are at large. You can have areas that are wards and have a hybrid system. You can have a complete at-large system. So what the legislation really says is that there's a process you have to go through, but ultimately all these things are up to council to decide. And that last one, which is mainly what we're doing now, is if you have wards, you also have the authority to divide those wards or redivide those wards, which means you can create different wards, you can create more wards, you can split those wards. So all up to council to make those decisions. And with the exception of the ward part of it, so how the size of council, how council is elected, that's also not appealable. So council makes those decisions, that's final according to council. With regard to the wards and the ward boundary decisions, that's something that is appealable to the Ontario Land Tribunal. So those are some important things to take away. The last thing too, and really it's the first thing on the chart on the right, there's no schedule, there's no process. Like I said, the legislation is quite vague that when it comes to it. But because the ward boundary review part is appealable to the OLT, there is a defined process that we follow through all the ward boundaries that we've done over the last couple of decades, through decisions when we look at Ontario Land Tribunal appeals of ward boundary and look at what the decisions were and how the appeal was decided, case law has come out of that. And from that, we've really started to determine some criteria, some parameters, and as we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, some guidelines that really help define how we do a ward boundary review. And ultimately, the things that we need to ensure we look at and the things that we ensure from feedback are important to this community as well. So spending a couple of minutes, we talked about the committee at the very beginning, and I think most of council is familiar with most of the members. I just want to spend a minute talking about sort of their role, so that's clear as well. So not every ward boundary review that is completed or that my firm does has a committee. But for me personally, I work with a lot of committees in other areas of my work. And as a consultant, it's always a benefit, I think, to have a committee made up of local members, because especially as a consultant, who works all over the province and all over the country, I rely a lot on data, and I rely a lot on some of the things that we talked about. But what the committee does for us is really ground truths, and I love using that word, and I hope I don't use it too much, but it really ground truths what we're coming at this analysis with. We have certain ideas, we have, like I said, certain data that's gonna lead to certain assumptions, but when we filter all of that through the committee, not only as residents, but some who have been actual members of council, we get a really good and different perspective that I think gives us a really good filter before we go out to the public and ultimately before we go out to council as well. So that, in a nutshell, is really what the committee is intended to do, is really provide that sort of different lens, different perspective for us as we start to work on recommendations and not even just with regard to the recommendations, but I mean, they provided a really beneficial role with regard to everything in this project to date. And that means, all the information that's on the website, the topical discussion papers, the engagement plan, the timelines. We worked with the committee through all that. So I think, again, I just want council to understand what their role is and sort of the help that they provided throughout this process, especially to us. Ultimately, at the end, what we see this process, assuming it comes to a reasonable conclusion, is we're going to provide a report, we're going to provide recommendations, again, vetted through the committee, and then ultimately that report is going to come to council. As I've said a couple of times tonight, you have the final say, you have the final authority on the recommendations that you're going to receive. You make the final decision on what your council is going to look like and ultimately on what Innisfil's electoral arrangements are going to look like. So a couple of things just sort of as we near sort of, I think, the midpoint, and we'll get into some of the objectives of this study. And then I'll finish off tonight showing you sort of what the existing wards look like. As I mentioned, a couple of preliminary observations. And then I want to finish off, we based on some feedback from the committee, we ran a scenario that looks just at population parity, and I think it provides a really neat example for council, for the committee as well, to start to understand the different pushes and pulls that we're eventually going to get to when we start to look at a different possible ward redesign. And maybe just really quickly too, just as I say that, one thing that's also important to take away from this process is it doesn't necessarily mean we're going to redesign your wards. We're probably going to come up with a bunch of different options to consider, but perhaps some of the things in terms of our preliminary analysis that we look at tonight, no matter how we slice and dice these things, maybe we still get to that same spot. And the point I think I want to make is that doesn't mean that the review was unnecessary. That doesn't mean that it was a failure. What that means is that we looked at it, we reviewed it, and said, yeah, maybe the system has some issues, but we still think the system works. And this is a message that we try to give to councils all over the province, that it doesn't mean by doing a ward boundary review you're going to change your system or you're going to change your wards. What it means is that, as we looked at, 2009 was the last time the municipality looked at it, and a lot has changed. All it means is it's time to look at it. Maybe it needs a tune-up. Maybe you need a new car. Maybe your car is just fine as it is, but we don't know any of that unless we do the review. So just want to be clear about those points as well. So getting into the guiding principles. So we talked a little bit about, the process and, that the legislation is vague, but we do have case law to rely on with regard to appeals and Ontario Land Tribunal. And I mentioned that from that, over the last decade or so, we started to develop guiding principles to really help us understand, number one, what's important to council and the community, and number two, for council and the community to also understand, coming from us, that if there is an appeal, that these are the things that the appeal board, that the OLT is going to look at. So obviously when we design wards for you, we want to be considerate of these guiding principles. We don't want to give you a system that we cannot defend if it does get appealed. So we always have that sort of light over us to help guide us. So four main ones, and then the last one we'll talk about is really an overarching guiding principle. So the first one, representation by population. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because it's an obvious one, right? We looked already at a couple of stats where, population has doubled since amalgamation. We know the amount of growth that's occurred in Simcoe County and Innisfil over the last several years, and we'll look a little bit at that. And not only that, but we know what's expected to occur. So when I talk about the guiding principles, it's 1 and 3, representation by population, but also population and electoral trends, because it's not only what's going on today, but we're trying to give you a system that you don't have to change at the next election. We're trying to give you a system that hopefully is good for a couple of elections. So what we also want to do is look at what the population is going to do and where, right? Because that's part of it, is not just how big are you going to get, but where are you going to grow? And is that going to create more imbalance between the wards? Is that going to create more inequity for councillors where some have X number of residents and sometimes other councillors have 3 times as many residents that they have to deal with? So that's obviously a big one. Representation by population is going to be an overriding principle as part of this. But like we'll look at in a couple of minutes at this map, it can't be the only thing. In provincial and federal ridings, that's all. It's literally just a numbers exercise that's probably done by a computer, and it just looks at population figures and tries to create equity according to population figures. But it doesn't have any other guiding principles. It doesn't have the other 2 that we're going to talk about. And for me, the second one is just as important as population representation, and that's communities of interest. So communities of interest, what we're talking about here is that Innisfil is your municipality, but we all know it came from amalgamation. So just coming from amalgamation, you're going to have a history. You're going to have a history of places that weren't Innisfil until they got put together. And sometimes when it got put together in amalgamation, it was great and made a lot of sense. And sometimes not so much. And sometimes it made sense for 4 of the 5 former places and not so much for 1. But that's kind of where we're at today. And as much as, I would imagine that the government at the time hoped that in 2024, the villages and municipalities that got amalgamated in the late 80s and early 90s, I'm guessing that they didn't think that those would still be communities of interest. I don't know, but they still are, very much so, right? And a lot of people in these amalgamated municipalities, like I come from Hamilton, and I don't know anyone that lives in Dundas and Ancaster that says, I'm from Hamilton. They say, I'm from Ancaster, and they say, I'm from Dundas. And it's the same thing in tons of municipalities we work at that have been amalgamated. These people, a lot of the people who live here still identify with that former amalgamated place or the village. So we want to try to recognize that as much as we can. We don't want to, create a ward system, and we'll look at the example we created with population parity because it does exactly this. But we want to try not to create a ward system that has one settlement area that, this piece goes into that ward and this piece goes into that ward. And you live in that settlement area and you don't really have a clear definition of who represents you or where that boundary line, stops and starts. So communities of interest is a really, really important one. And again, not just for me and not just for, my team, but again, going back to the OLT and the appeal process, if municipalities only look at representation by population and they get appealed based on this community of interest guiding principle, you're probably going to lose. And the case law is pretty clear about that. And ultimately, what this ward boundary process becomes is a balancing act. I talked about these pushes and pulls, right? We know we have to get rep by pop, right? We know we have to do that. But to get there and still balance these other guiding principles, what do we do? And there's going to be trade-offs. We're not going to have a perfect, or rarely are we going to have a system where I say, here's the 7 wards or whatever that number ends up being. We have perfect population parity. We haven't, divided up any urban settlements. We've used rivers and roads, and it just doesn't happen. And like I said, maybe there's been one I can think of in the years that I've been doing this, but the reality is there's going to be some trade-offs, and that's what we ultimately have to decide from listening to the public and us telling you what the public thinks is important, and ultimately what council thinks is important. Is rep by pop more important than community of interest? Vice versa? Should they be balanced equally? Though that's all the fun, at least for someone who does ward boundaries, that's kind of the fun stuff that we're going to get to. The last one, number 4, is physical and natural boundaries, and it ties into what I just spoke about. If you can have an idea and clearly know where your ward is defined, it helps with identification. It helps with knowing who your counselor is. So we try to, as much as possible, use physical and natural boundaries. We don't want to, if we could help it, create a ward where, Main River bisects that ward or Main Highway bisects that ward. Again, not always possible when we're trying to balance the other guiding principles, but those are kind of the 4 main ones that we try to work through as we're designing wards. And I said at the beginning that last one, effective representation, that's kind of the overarching principle here. That's ultimately what we're trying to do with the ward boundary review, is provide for your community, for your citizens here, for your residents, effective representation based on all those different things that I spoke about. And again, maybe not perfect, but that's the ultimate principle that we're trying to achieve by hitting most of these other ones, again, in a redesign or a design of a ward system. So the process so far, we started out very early. Our first sort of phase of a ward boundary process is really a research phase. It's what I talked about. It's working with the committee, working with your staff. Council was interviewed, the committee was interviewed. It's really starting to get to know Innisfil and understand the different tensions, the different positives, what's really working with council, what's not, what do individual councillors think about their wards and the system. So that's really that first phase of this review, is really that sort of, get to know you kind of phase and how did you get here kind of phase. From there, that next phase was really project launch. And project launch started when we got the contract and started meeting with your staff. It's not that kind of project launch, but more a public launch. And luckily, we had some synergy with Local Governance Week. So we tried to tie in with that as much as we can to ensure that word was out there, ward boundary review process had started, information that I spoke about, products on the website, surveys, quizzes, papers, videos, all of that stuff was really part of the launch. And the launch led to that next phase, which was the public engagement. And I spoke briefly about it, where we had some in-person sessions, more of a carousel type session, drop in, where people were able to come in, speak to, if council was there, staff, as well as a consultant team, look at different boards and ward pictures. And in addition to that, there was also a virtual session that was held. That virtual session was also recorded. It's going to be put up on the website. So we're really that public engagement phase is not only, the engagement session, the virtual session, but it's all of this. It's those sessions, it's the information on the website, it's ensuring that there's, Twitter releases or Facebook release, or just ensuring that there's momentum with the community, understanding that this project is ongoing, and ensuring that they're aware of sort of what's to come. Because again, it's sort of that initial feedback and engagement phase is more freeform. It's more, getting some feedback about what your community thinks works, what doesn't, what they like, what they don't. And I'll be honest, it's tough to get decent engagement in that first round. But when we start to put out maps with lines and wards are moving, engagement is usually a lot better. You get in terms of numbers, in terms of the feedback that we actually get. Because I think when people start to see possibly their ward moving or their ward changing, usually people have thoughts. So that's kind of what we're now, in terms of the rest of the process. Like I said earlier, now it's about, coming up with options and then working towards that next round of engagement that's going to be late summer, early fall. We're going to go out, do similar sessions, both in person and virtual, same type of that carousel type session. Get all that feedback, and then the idea is to come back to council in November of 2024, again, vetted through the committee with final recommendations. And typically, we don't like to give council 8 options. We also don't like to give council just one option. So again, it might be 3, but in a perfect world, we like to give council 2 options. And the 2 kind of go back to the guiding principles that I spoke about. One is usually a little more population representation heavy, and one might be a little bit more community of interest heavy. But again, that ultimately is also going to depend on what we hear and what the wards allow us to, or what the municipality and the current settlement areas kind of allow us to do with a redesign. So I think if I hopefully I'm doing a decent job tonight, we've answered most of this question about, you know, why the municipality is doing it, why municipalities in general look at ward boundaries and council composition reviews. So I don't want to spend a lot of time there, so I'll go to the next slide and just kind of summarize some of the objectives that we're trying to get out of this review. So we talked about that first phase, and now, you know, at the conclusion of tonight's meeting, I think it's fair to say we're at that end of that first phase of research collection, feedback from the public, giving the consultant team the information they need to go off into phase two. As I discussed, phase two is going to start to look at the strengths and weaknesses of the system, incorporate what we've heard, and start to come up with a redesign and different options for council to consider with that ultimate outcome that I spoke about a second ago, a presentation and recommendations to council. So just to go through the public consultation process very quickly, I think I actually went through most of this as I spoke about the process. A couple of things I just want to highlight for council as we talk about public engagement. So one thing that we work really hard to do, and we're always open to feedback on this as well, is to make the engagement accessible. And what I mean by that is to ensure that it's not just online, it's not just technical, it's not just in person. It's a combination of all those different things, even giving people ability for virtual meetings to call in using their phone if they don't have online. Ensuring that there's paper copies at the in-person meetings so that you know, not everyone has a smartphone and is going to take a picture of a QR code. So that's really one of the main things that I think we've learned over the last decade of doing public engagement, is to make sure that it is accessible to everyone. Because really, I don't want to give council a recommendation and have someone from the public then tell you that they weren't able to access materials, they weren't able to get the same information. So that's really the main goal, I think, of engagement, is to make sure that it is across, you know, demographics, across age spectrums, across technology. So that's one of the main things that we're trying to do through this engagement process. And the other thing that I want council to be aware of is that we don't try to come in, when I say we, the consultant team, and try to reinvent the wheel. We really want to work closely with your staff, with your communications department, in terms of, you know what works, you know what elicits good feedback in Innisfil. So we try to work within those confines as much as we can. And I think it's worked to date so far pretty well. So a couple of things with regard to next steps. So really, I talked about the immediate next step is redesigning or coming up with options with possible redesign of your existing wards. In addition, we said we're going to make recommendations to the committee, work with them to provide a final report and a final presentation. I want to make this point again, I said it a little while ago, is that we're trying to also provide a system that's going to be good for two elections, for 2026 and 2030. So really trying to factor in that growth element, that change in how settlements are going to grow and how wards are going to change. And we'll look at already how it's happening in a minute. And then ultimately, the final step is if council agrees to one of the recommendations or options, or perhaps it's going to be a hybrid, right? We've also done that where we've come to council with final recommendations, and it's almost been a little bit of a mishmash where council has taken some things they like from one option, some things they like from another option. So that's always a possibility as well. Council could come up with their own option, but ultimately, if council agrees to some sort of ward boundary change, the next step or the final step for council would be to pass a bylaw enacting those changes. Okay, so I just want to spend sort of the last minutes before we talk about, or hopefully there's some questions and some discussion, showing a couple of things that I started to allude to. So what we're looking at, maybe a couple of things first. So first thing is we look at growth from 2016 and 2021. The reason we use these years are census periods, so it's just good census data. So the first thing we look at is from 16 to 21, your population was around 36,500 in 2016. grew to about 43,300 in 2021. So obviously a lot of growth in that 5-year period, so changing the overall population of Innisfil. But really, when we talk about representation by population, this is what becomes quite glaring when you look at some of the wards and the population right now. So typically, the OLT, Ontario Land Tribunal, I spoke about that where ward boundaries are appealable to, they like to use a rule of about 25% variance from the average ward population. So in 2016, what you see in that dark red are 3 of the wards that were outside of that 25% population variance. Fast forward to 2021, a couple of wards actually got better and fell within the population range, but the reason those fell into population range were largely because the other wards continued to grow and fall out of population range, or did not grow at all and stayed stable while other areas grew. So in 2021, where you had 3 of the 7 wards out of population variance by more than 25%, in 2021, it's 4 wards. And again, when we start to look at how Innisfil is going to grow and where Innisfil is going to grow, I don't look at that population variance and say it's going to get better. It's not. It's going to continue to have that type of variance. So again, from a population perspective, right off the bat, we know that we don't have representation by population. We know that we have some wards that are extremely small. We have some wards that are extremely large, but all of those wards still only have 1 councillor per ward. So obviously there's an inequity when we look at representation by population. A couple of other things we notice, and again, this is by no means to say with these next points that it necessarily means we have to change anything, just observations at this point. But when we look at 7 of the 7 wards, 6 of the 7 wards have some piece of waterfront. So again, just an observation. Does that make sense? Should it be concentrated? Should all the wards have a piece of waterfront? These are the types of things that, again, are just a preliminary observation, but that we're going to start to play with and start to look at. The other thing we noticed, we talked a lot about population, but I mentioned early on in terms of the uniqueness of different municipalities, ward size. And so the other thing that is quite glaring when you look at the map is you notice that 2 wards are extremely large compared to the other 5 wards. Maybe in a more compact place that makes sense, but does it make sense in a municipality like Innisfil? Does it make sense for those 2 wards to be so large? Again, I don't know, but those are the kind of things that we're going to start to look at. So right off the bat, right, without spending hours of time presenting to you about the analysis, we can look at this slide and right off the bat say, well, there's some community of interest issues, there's some population issues, there's probably some physical and geographic issues that we're not considering. So all of the guiding principles, there's some issues here. Again, that's not to say that you need to recreate the ward system, but it's to say that, in terms of what we look at, yeah, there's definitely some things that we should highlight to you and start to look at. The other thing, and like I said, I had a brief chat with one of the committee members just before the meeting tonight, but this came out of a discussion that we had with the committee, and it's something that we actually, my firm does at the very beginning and when we start to look at ward options. And this is really, maybe I don't want to disrespect Josh that I talked about earlier, but it's largely a software GIS exercise that he runs to achieve as close as possible perfect population parity, right? So that's what this example has done, is it's taken your 7 wards and said, if we want, again, not perfect, but pretty perfect population parity, we can achieve that with 7 wards. And if you look at the chart on the right, I mean, most of them are 98, 99% of the average. And the only one that's outside of the 5% is Ward 7 at 11% off the average. So again, a pretty much perfect population parity system. But right off the bat, when you look at the map, there's some things that start to happen. Places like Sandy Cove get divided into 2 wards. Stroud, 2 wards. Alcona, 5 of the 7 wards, and I sort of gave this as an example earlier because I knew we were getting to this, 5 of 7 wards have a piece of Alcona. So that's that example I gave where one settlement area, you could be in that ward or that ward or that ward. It really just depends on what section of that settlement community you live in. So we thought in the existing system we had 2 large wards. Well, now we have a gigantic ward in terms of Ward 1 on the screen. So again, we start to really see, I hope what I'm talking about tonight is that I can give you a perfect system like the provincial and federal government does that's going to achieve population parity for you. And maybe with that system, the municipality, the residents, the council can say, we're okay with the things that it doesn't give us, the things that I just mentioned. But that's, again, what we're going to try to find out is, are we okay with this? Or do we want to try to find some trade-offs and balance that I spoke about where we want to achieve as close as possible to this, but we want to recognize some of those other guiding principles as well. So just to finish off tonight, a couple of things that we have heard so far. And these are some things that we've heard both at the engagement sessions as well as the survey. And at the bottom of each kind of dialogue box, I just tied it back to the guiding principles that we spoke about. So again, even from the public, even if they might not know what the guiding principles are, they recognize what the guiding principles are by recognizing what sort of their issues are and what they want to see. So recognition of rural and agricultural communities was something that we've heard in engagement and through the survey. Feeds back to communities of interest. That's really exactly what we're talking about. Population parity is a priority. I just spent 5-10 minutes talking about that. Back to guiding principle, representation by population. Comment, Lefroy should fall entirely within a single ward. Again, exactly what we just talked about, that we can get population parity, but maybe that doesn't happen. So there's that, again, community of interest that is coming back up. And recognizing how communities are connected. And this really plays into that other guiding principle of utilizing physical and natural boundaries. Are we grouping places in the right way? Are we using the right physical and natural boundaries we have to create those definitions so people know what ward we live in and where my ward ends and where the next ward begins? So to me, I mean, from again, early round of engagement, the fact that these are the kind of comments we're getting is telling me that there's a community that is knowledgeable, that is engaged, and that is aware of the different, like I said, push and pulls that any electoral system is going to have. So I think that's it for me. I know I talk a lot and I talk fast, so I hope everyone kind of got that in. But I'm going to be quiet for a little while and see if there's any comments, questions, or if anyone on the committee wants anything to add as well. So thanks for your attention thus far.
Thank you, Chair Orsatti. Anything from the committee to add at this point?
Thank you. I think it's been great that we've had some, first steps with the public, starting in the library, having one where people could attend, look at all the placement cards, ask questions, and it was a great location because people that weren't aware of it, it drew the interest. But I think the best tip as a chair and as a member of the committee that I can give to the public or to council members that didn't have a chance to attend that, go on the Get Involved site in the town of Innisfil and pull up that virtual open house because it provides a perfect condensed show of interest and information for this whole process and explains the steps and the interest. And it's been wonderful working with Watson Associates and Jack and Robert and Josh. And if I can also just take this time to introduce the committee members, because these are people who are volunteers, and for new members on council, just to give you a little bit of a background of the strength and the input and the knowledge that we have from long-term residents. I'm going to start with Vice Chair Rob Nicol, who was councillor of Ward 7. And 2 terms, Rob? Yes, 2 terms, and living and having a business in town. And then we have Bill Van Berkel, who was a councillor in the ward beside me, Ward 2. And I believe, Bill, you have over 20 years' experience on council and business and living in the town. So that background and also where the orbit is going to be placed. We have Paul Wardlaw, who, comes from an agricultural background. And I believe you had Ward 1, was it? Yes. And so giving that input from an agricultural and those unique needs, when we look at, it's not only about population, as Jack said, but the needs that are specific to that ward that may be different than some of the others. Myself, I had Ward 3 that Councillor Richardson now has, the smallest ward in geographical size, but the largest population intensified. So the needs change and the service level changes. So I think that this is a perfect time that the town takes a look at how the wards are set up. Involving the public is key, and then getting that input, working together with the input also from the committee members, and I missed one who was not able to attend tonight, Emma Perry, who gave her regrets, but she had another commitment. And she's a resident of Cookstown and brings her work background and perspective into this as well. But I think it's a perfect time to look at, as Jack said, what we're doing, does it make sense? Do we need to tweak? And we need to look at what is the growth that is projected for Innisfil? How would that change wards? And knowing that information, and you want to make a change for looking at for the next 3 terms, 12 years of council, then how does that fit into that? So all of that information will come into this. As Jack said, it will come back in a final presentation. There's another public, I believe, where we will also be getting some suggestions out to the public, getting their feedback, but ultimately comes back to council. Council makes the decision. And if it's anything like the county council, who had to look at going from 32 to 16, it will be a fun time.
Thank you, Chair Arsati. Now go to members of council with any questions, comments. Councillor Waters.
Thank you, Worship. Well, I think we have the right committee to take a look at this. We have a lot of experience, diversity, so I'm quite pleased with the committee that we have. I think it's going to be quite challenging, and specifically with the future trends and populations that are going to have the orbit, Big Bay Point, all those types of things. So I really look forward to seeing what alternatives you come up with, because there are a lot of challenges out there. So to see how you balance all those guidelines to come up with the appropriate distribution of wards in the future. So good luck, and I look forward to August when we see this. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Other questions or comments from members of council? None? I have a couple I'd like to bring forward. So thank you so much for all of the work that you've done so far. I think the reason I'm here is because of amalgamation in 1991. And the village of Cookstown and the township of Innisfil were amalgamated at that time. And so I've seen a lot of changes, but I've also worked with a lot of municipalities where it hasn't worked so well. And I can truly say here in Innisfil, I believe, even though there has been some issues like the split down Clarny Beach, Lefroy, and Clarny Beach and Lefroy is one of them, but it's worked well for us. And I think the ward system has worked very well for us. When I was first on council, our tagline in the official plan was the community of communities. And that's who we identified as. Nobody was trying to be Innisfil. Everybody wanted to be Lefroy, Belleurt, Big Bay Point, Sandy Cove, Guildford. I'm going to forget one and be in trouble. But that's the way it was. So it was really important that everybody heard their voice in one of those wards. Whereas other places, I would argue, like Wasaga Beach, nobody in Wasaga Beach says they're on East Wasaga Beach or West Wasaga Beach, they're just in Wasaga Beach. And they have one community of interest. Collingwood is the same. I would argue places like the city of Barrie should be at large because, again, it's one community. But I totally get you from Hamilton, also Mississauga, similar, Port Credit, like it's still Cooksville, it's still Streetsville. So I totally understand that aspect of it. So I do think that community of interest is a huge, as is Rep by Pop, always a huge consideration. But a couple of things that keep me up at night are more items that have happened to councils that have been based on usually one circumstance, one thing that catches the public's interest at that one time, typically in an election year, and it becomes everybody's big issue. And I'll use, so Tiny Township will be my example for the first one. So there was a lot of issues around whether the public access to the beach and, big, rich city folk were coming up and buying scads of property and cottages in Tiny Township and building right out to the water's edge so people couldn't walk along the beach. It became very contentious. People were setting fires to people's fences, trying to keep their private area. The next election, they elected an entire tiny council with not one resident who actually lived in the community. Everybody lived in another community, and they were all seasonal in Tiny Township. Another time it happened, it was different. It was actually a school board issue. It was over a Francophone school in LaFontaine that was going to be closed, and again, all of council was from LaFontaine in the next election. And then the most recent example, and it's a little bit farther afield, but right now, if you Google Surrey, BC, so Surrey, BC elected a council that was about getting their own police force and getting away from the RCMP. And then the community elected everyone on council who wanted to stay with the RCMP and get rid of the Surrey Police Force. And they've now been, I think, 3 years in place. They have not done one other thing on their council except fight with the provincial government over the policing. It's totally taken over the whole agenda of the municipality. And that's what I'm afraid of, is like a one-issue thing that could draw. So I think that needs to be taken into account when picking those lines. So let's say that every ward had shoreline. And let's say all of a sudden, Council of the Day decided we were going to outlaw docks. No more docks in the town of Innisfil. So then you're going to end up, your next council, there's going to be a shoreline resident from every one of those wards that's elected, because that's going to be the issue of the day. So that's my only one concern, really, with, but as long as we do community of interest, I've sat through a federal realignment boundary, which was painful. Our interest at that time was because our riding was going to be known as Barrie South, as opposed to Barrie Innisfil. We were successful in changing it to Barrie Innisfil. But again, it became a bit of a what's in it for me exercise, because if one party felt they had more support in this area, they wanted the boundary around where their polling was telling them they had more support. So it was really quite a different process than what we end up with here. But certainly, thank you. Looking forward to seeing what you come up with, and definitely for like a councillor like Councillor Constantine, whose population has doubled since the last census, then we definitely do need to see some changes.
Yeah. So I appreciate those comments, and just really quickly touching on a couple of them. With regard to some of the issues you talked about and how some councils have been elected on those issues, that's also a benefit of a ward system, right? Is that hopefully if the ward system is designed properly, that you're not going to allow one issue that overrides that whole council, because hopefully 4 of the other wards don't care about that issue and they have their own things that are going on. But you're right, if the system isn't designed properly, you can have wards that and the waterfront is a great example, and that's why I raised it as well, is that if you have wards that are too homogeneous and they're all the same and the issues are all the same, then you can have a ward system where that exact same thing happens. So yeah, I think that's a good reason to have wards, and you highlighted a couple of issues why. But more importantly, that has to go into the design as well. It's like I say, like I think a lot of times when I talk about ward boundaries, it's looked at as an election day exercise. And what I'm trying to tell people is that's just one part of it. This is really about the day after the election, right? That's where it's really important, is to ensure that your wards are designed correctly, because yeah, it's important for that day, but it's really, like I said, about accessibility to this council, right, for your residents. So it's really, like I said, about that day and 3 year and 3/4 years after. So appreciate those comments.
Thank you. Yes, none of this makes any difference to our constituents until they need representation and they have a problem, and then it becomes very important. Other questions or comments from members of council? Seeing none, we look forward to hearing from you more in the future, and thanks again to the committee for all of your hard work. So I'm going to I have a recommendation that the comments received at the Ward Boundary Council Compensation Review Session be forwarded to staff for consideration. And that's moved by Councillor Zanella and seconded by Deputy Mayor Fowler. All those in favor? That is carried. And finally, we have the confirming bylaw and adjournment at 6:54 p.m. Moved by Councillor Drodge, seconded by Councillor Richardson. All those in favor? That is carried. Thanks again, everyone. And for those joining online, thank you for your interest.